Good evening, everyone. My name is Ayman Abu Shirbi, and I want to welcome you all on behalf of the organization Palestine at MIT. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, Arab Student Organization, MIT Muslim Student Association, and MIT World. You'll be able to view a video broadcast of this event shortly on MIT World. In the midst of the occurring misfortunate events that are happening in the Middle East, we thought of someone who can shed an objective light regarding the issue. And we couldn't think of anyone better than Professor Chomsky. And of course, he doesn't need an introduction. But for those who don't know him, Noam Chomsky is the Institute's Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT. Chomsky is credited with the creation of the theory of generative grammar, considered to be the most significant contribution to the field of theoretical linguistics made in the 20th century. Professor Chomsky, welcome.
Thanks. Well, I see you managed to find your way through the maze of room changes, so that's a help. We almost were assigned to the Lockheed Martin room, but escaped by a miracle, although that in a way would have been appropriate for what I'm going to talk about. The title that was announced was The Current Crisis in the Middle East, singular, which is a mistake. It's my fault. It should have been crises, plural, because there are quite a few of them. There are at least four major ones. The first is Palestine, which is being systematically destroyed, both of its parts, Gaza and the West Bank. Second is Lebanon, which has just been largely destroyed once again. That's the fifth Israeli invasion in 30 years, all backed by the United States, which is the part that ought to concern us. The third is Iraq, which is a hideous catastrophe and getting worse. And the fourth is Iran, which is an impending catastrophe that could blow up the whole region. And it doesn't take much imagination to think of others. Well, I'm going to say a few words about each of them, mainly the first two, Lebanon and Palestine, which I think are closely linked. So let's start with Palestine. It's commonly recognized, and rightly, to be the core of the good deal of the turmoil and conflict in the region. In much of the world, that conflict, Israel-Palestine, is regarded as the most serious threat to peace in the world. It seems on the surface to be hopeless. It's degenerating into something like tribal warfare with a familiar cycle of escalating violence, revenge, and fanaticism. It's not entirely false, but it's a highly misleading picture because there is a very reasonable solution which could lead to peace and security, maybe lay a basis for something more satisfactory for the people of the two peoples, both populations, and for the region. Furthermore, it's well known. It's also well known, or should be, why it's still only a hope, not a reality. The basic outlines of a solution were formally presented at the UN Security Council 30 years ago, in January 1976. That was a resolution backed by the major Arab states, most of the world, supported by the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. It incorporated the wording, the basic essential wording of what everyone recognizes on all sides to be the core diplomatic document, UN 242 of November 1967, incorporated that wording, including recognition of the rights of all states in the region to live in peace and security within recognized borders. But it added something to UN 242. 242 said nothing about the Palestinians, except they're refugees and something ought to be done for them. But by the mid-'70s, the Palestinian issue had entered the international agenda, and the January 1976 resolution called for two states side by side, both recognized, both living in peace and security within recognized borders, with some variations. These have been the basic outlines of a settlement right up to the present. There's a few changes, but not much. Israel refused to attend. Instead, it bombed Nabatea, a town in southern Lebanon, killing many inhabitants with anti-personnel weapons, rockets, and bombs. No credible pretext was ever offered, and it presumably was retaliation against the United Nations for daring to consider a political settlement. However, there was no need for Israeli concern. Big Brother stepped in, vetoed the resolution. That's first of several, another one in 1980. Since then, there's a host of General Assembly resolutions. I won't run through them. The votes are usually something like 150 to 2 or something like that, virtually annually. Nabatea was reduced to ruins last July. Once again, it was another act of wanton savagery, actually particularly vivid for several of us here because we just visited it. It was a couple of weeks ago, a flourishing, hopeful town. Walked its streets, were welcomed into homes, now all heaps of rubble, even burial grounds for people we met. The 1976 resolution was not only supported by the major Arab states, Arab confrontation states as they were called, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, but as I mentioned, they were also supported by the PLO, which denounced what it called the tyranny of the veto after the United States vetoed it. Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, who was later president, denounced the resolution, claimed that it was written by the PLO, which is extremely unlikely. It was a bit paranoid, but the paranoia is understandable. Israel has been very deeply concerned about the prospect of the threat of peace for quite a long time, and for a very simple reason. Peace means the end of expansion, and it also grants rights to the indigenous population, recognizes their existence, and that's psychologically difficult for many people to accept. And it continues until today. One of Israel's most astute and informed commentators for a great many years, Uri Avneri, had an article about a week ago with the headline, "Help Peacemongers." It opened like this, and it sort of summarizes what's been going on for 30 years. It said, "In the corridors of power in Jerusalem, the cry is going up, 'Help, peace is upon you, Israel. A terrible enemy is conspiring to impose peace on us. He's advancing against us from two sides in a giant pincer movement. The one arm of the offensive is the Palestinian Unity Government that's about to be set up. The other is the decision of the Arab League to revive the Arab Peace Plan of 2002. He knows what he's talking about. This has been going on for years. In fact, 1976, which I mentioned, was not the first case. The first case, and a very important one, was 1971. In 1971, President Sadat of Egypt offered Israel a full peace treaty, almost exactly in the terms of official U.S. government policy at the time. Israel recognized it to be a genuine peace offer. The cabinet considered it and decided to reject it. It was a choice. They preferred expansion to security. That would have meant security. It would have meant the end of the international conflict for all intents and purposes. Expansion at that time was primarily into the northeastern Sinai, where Israel had expelled thousands of farmers, driven them into the desert, destroyed towns, mosques, cemeteries, leveled the place in order to establish a new city, an all-Jewish city called Yamit, and a group of several kibbutzim and other settlements. This, incidentally, was the labor government, regarded as the doves. A real question was how the U.S. would react. Would it continue with its earlier policy, therefore supporting Egypt's peace offer, or would it shift and support Israeli expansion? There was a discussion. Kissinger prevailed, national security advisor at the time, and the United States adopted his policy of what he called stalemate, meaning no negotiations, just force. That led directly to the 1973 war, which turned out to be a very close thing for Israel, and it compelled the United States and Israel to accept Sadat's 1971 proposal. It took several years, but after many negotiations, the United States finally accepted the 1971 offer in 1979 at Camp David. That is recorded in U.S. history as a great triumph of U.S. peacemaking. In fact, it was a diplomatic disaster, which led to a major war, virtual serious threat of nuclear war, anguish and torment for years, and was finally accepted. Actually, the terms that the U.S. and Israel finally accepted in 1979 were harsher from their point of view than the ones Sadat offered in 1971. His 71 offer also said nothing about the Palestinians, just vague mention of rights of refugees. But as I said, by the mid-70s, the Palestinian national issue had entered the international agenda. Sadat brought it up, and there was various hand-waving about it. Well, that 1971 decision, which unfortunately is rarely discussed, I think was one of the most fateful ones in Israel's history, and in fact the history of the region. Israel and the United States had a clear choice. The choice was for Israel, one option was for Israel to integrate peacefully into the region. The alternative was to live by the sword, meaning in particular becoming a U.S. client state, because there's no other way for it to live by the sword. Israel chose the second option. As I mentioned, that almost led to its destruction in 1973, and it's proceeding in the same directions since, going right to the present. So take what happened this summer, the ongoing destruction of Palestine and the destruction of much of Lebanon before our eyes. Nobody seriously doubts that that's creating new generations of jihadis full of hatred, committed to revenge, with consequences that will apply to Israel and much more broadly, perhaps here as well. Well, Israel is by no means alone in assigning a low priority to security, preferring, in this case, expansion. Assigning a low priority to security in comparison with other aims is pretty standard state behavior. For example, it's standard for the Israel's superpower patron. Many, many examples. The most dramatic recent example is the invasion of Iraq. It was undertaken with the expectation by intelligence agencies and others that it would lead to an increase in terror and nuclear proliferation. The dynamics are understood. And it did, in fact, to a degree well beyond what had been anticipated. But there were other priorities, and increasing the risk of terror, maybe nuclear terror, maybe nuclear war, is just not a high priority for state managers. Many examples. History is replete with examples. This threat of peace has arisen, that Avneri talks about, has arisen constantly. Take 1982. That was the year of the worst U.S.-Israeli invasion of Lebanon. I call it U.S.-Israeli invasion because although the forces were Israeli, the arms are U.S. The United States provides the diplomatic support, vetoes resolutions to end the conflict, and so on. So that was the worst U.S.-Israeli invasion, and we understand the reasons. There's a pretty good record. Immediately after the invasion, Israel's leading scholar on Palestinians, a Hebrew University professor, Yehoshua Porat, who's incidentally no dove, explained in Israel's leading newspaper that Israel was facing what the government regarded as a veritable catastrophe, in his words. The veritable catastrophe was embarrassing PLO offers for negotiations, which were becoming harder and harder to evade. That would be a catastrophe, he said, from the point of view of Israel's government. It's much better to drive the PLO back to terrorism and avoid this dread threat of political settlement. Well, it was pretty openly described at the highest political and military echelons as a war for the West Bank, and a devastating war. There is a propaganda version, which is transmitted to reporters and commentators. Thomas Friedman is a typical example. According to him and many others, the invasion was undertaken to protect northern Israel from Palestinian rockets. The only problem with that is that there weren't any Palestinian rockets. There had been a ceasefire established after conflict a year earlier. The Palestinians had adhered to it rigorously, despite extensive and sometimes quite murderous Israeli violations, which apparently were an effort to elicit a retaliation, which would be a pretext for the planned invasion. When no pretext could be found, one was invented, and the invasion took place. The first act of the invasion was to bomb Sabra Shatila refugee camp, later the site of a famous or infamous massacre. That bombing, which opened the war, killed 200 Palestinians in the camps, according to an American Middle East specialist, Cheryl Rubenstein, who was there at the time. The invasion went on to kill maybe 15 to 20,000 more people. We really never know the numbers of our victims. They're not counted. The only numbers that are counted, where you have detailed forensic analysis to try to pick up every piece of bone and so on, as somebody else's crimes. But the rough estimate is in the 15 to 20,000 range, destroyed much of Lebanon. The pretexts for the other invasions, including the latest one in July, collapse on the slightest examination. I won't run through them. There's plenty in print. They largely reduce, when you look at them, to the same motives, same concerns. One concern is maintaining the rejectionist stance with respect to Palestinian rights, rejecting it unilaterally in the world. And the second is maintaining regional dominance for what has become, predictably, since 1971, a U.S. client state by now, virtually an offshore military base and high-tech center. The invasion in July is not much different. Same basic reasons, except there was another one, plausible reason, and we don't have internal documents, obviously, so anything you say is speculation. But another likely reason was to eliminate a Lebanese-based deterrent to an eventual attack on Iran if the U.S. and Israel decide to undertake it. Well, the U.S.-Israeli rejectionism is not rhetoric. It also goes on to deeds, which is a lot more important. It means regular projects of settlement in the occupied territories, huge infrastructure projects, breaking them up, right through the Oslo years, the years of the so-called Oslo peace process from 1993 to 2000. Settlement and infrastructure development continued steadily, steady pace all along. U.S. paid for it. Israel carried it out. The peak was Clinton's last year, 2000, also the last year of Prime Minister Barak. In that year, leading right up to the Camp David meetings, settlement increased, the pace of settlement increased by almost 50%, but it was steady. Then come Bush and Sharon, it's all accelerated. Today there's a euphemism for it, it's called convergence, and we're supposed to praise it as courageous withdrawal. Actually, the convergence program announced a couple of months ago is a program of annexation and dismemberment and imprisonment explicitly. It annexes valuable lands. Israel annexes valuable lands and the major resources, particularly water. The rest of the shrinking territories assigned to Palestinians are broken up, dismembered into virtually separated cantons, all of them virtually separated from whatever sliver of Jerusalem is to be left to Palestinians. It's the center of commercial, educational, cultural, political life. And it's all imprisoned because Israel's effectively annexing the Jordan Valley. You look at a map, it's imprisoned. And of course, airspace and any other access. All of this is fulfilling goals which were set out quite clearly in the early days of the occupation under the labor government. They were described to the cabinet, for example, by Moshe Dayan, who was one of them among the Israeli leaders, one of the most sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. His advice to the cabinet was that Israel should tell the Palestinians in the territories that we have no solution. You shall continue to live like dogs, and whoever wishes may leave, and we will see where this process leads. And that's the leading principle of the occupation, right up to the present, becoming harsher all the time. The background reasoning was given by Chaim Herzog, later president, as I mentioned, in 1972. He said, "I do not deny the Palestinians a place or stand or opinion on every matter, but certainly I am not prepared to consider them as partners in any respect in a land that has been consecrated in the hands of our nation for thousands of years for the Jews of this land," and that means everything to the west of the Jordan. There cannot be any partner. For much of the leadership, it meant east of the Jordan, too. Well, it wasn't unanimous. Not everyone agreed. One of those who didn't agree was the hawkish military governor of the West Bank, General Shlomo Gazit, who's recently written his memoirs, which are quite illuminating. He describes how the military government and Israeli military intelligence forwarded to the political leadership. This remembers the dovish political leadership, kept forwarding to them proposals for some degree of local autonomy for Palestinians, for what are called notables, the wealthier sectors, the mayors, and so on, just some form of self-government. The Israeli government had no interest at all, didn't even respond, just rejected all such proposals. Their intent was full Israeli control, what Dayan called permanent rule over the territories and expansion into the Sinai at that time. Pretty much the same policies are carried out within Israel. So just 2 days ago, one of Israel's most outstanding journalists, Amir Haas, reviewed a new book by Israeli historian Hillel Cohen. It's based on recently released internal records. And it outlines, I'll quote a review, it outlines the official paradigm since 1948. Continued theft of lands, continued fragmentation and weakening of Arab society, and undermining the possibility of the Arabs developing an independent leadership. After 1967, same principles applied to the occupied territories, continuing with Haas. The paradigm is maximum weakening in every possible way of the Palestinian national collective so that it will not be able to realize its goal and establish a state worthy of the name. Policies included blocking education and social and economic development. It was all, she says, in the name of security, but not for its sake. And the record illustrates that very clearly. Apparently the internal documents spell out the planning. And the rejectionism is quite consistent, just to mention one other striking moment. In 1988, the Palestinian National Council formally accepted a two-state settlement on the international border. Before that, they had implicitly accepted it. And Israel had an immediate reaction. There was at the time a coalition government, Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres, and they came out immediately with a plan stating that first point was that there cannot be an additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. Presupposition is Jordan already is a Palestinian state, and they can't have a second one. Second position plank was that the fate of the territories will be decided in accord with the guidelines of the State of Israel. That proposal was immediately endorsed by George Bush #1 and James Baker, as Secretary of State. It was called the Baker Plan in December 1989, which simply endorsed without comment the Israeli program. That's the most extreme anti-Palestinian position that has formally been accepted by any U.S. government. Bush #1 is considered too critical of Israel, standard view. And most of this is under the rug, but it's there. And this goes on. In fact, to be precise, there has been one break. 1 week in Taba, in Egypt, in 2001, there was a week when Israeli and Palestinian negotiators came together, pursuing a peace plan. In their final session, after a week, they had a press conference in which they said if they had a little more time, they thought they could iron out the details and reach an agreement pretty much along the lines of the international consensus. Well, they didn't have any more time. Israel, Prime Minister Barak canceled the meetings early, and that's the end of that. But that's the one real break in 30 years of U.S.-Israeli rejectionism. After that, negotiations continued, what are called Track 2 negotiations, non-official negotiations with high-level negotiators. That continued, finally led to the Geneva Accord, which is released in December 2002, was welcomed by almost the entire world, Arab states, PLO. Israel rejected it outright. The U.S. simply dismissed it, didn't even respond. In fact, of all the major countries, the U.S. is the only one that didn't even send words of greeting to the Geneva Accords. And accordingly, it was simply dismissed and ridiculed in the U.S. press. And it's still there, but it's going to take a significant change in U.S. policy for anything like that to be implemented. Well, among the relevant actors today, this kind of political settlement, slight details changing, the general form of this settlement is accepted with near unanimity. It's formally accepted by the Arab League. That's the plan that Avneri was referring to, the 2002 Arab League plan, which called for normalization of relations with Israel, full normalization of relations within a two-state settlement. It's formally supported by Iran. That was reiterated recently by what they call the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, who's in charge of foreign policy, top cleric, reiterated that Iran accepts the Arab League plan. As far as I'm aware, that hasn't been reported in the United States. It's been accepted repeatedly by Hezbollah. The leader, Sayed Nasrallah, has repeatedly stated that Hezbollah doesn't want to recognize Israel, but it's a Lebanese organization, and if the Palestinians decide to recognize Israel in a two-state settlement, Hezbollah won't disrupt it. They're Lebanese. Hamas, now the government has made many statements indicating pretty clearly that they accept that plan, calling for negotiations for it. Actually, there are only two significant opponents of what here is called George Bush's vision of a two-state settlement. The two opponents are George Bush and his administration and Prime Minister Olmert of Israel, just pursuing the traditional policies of systematic rejectionism. Well, the U.S. liberal media, like our journal here, prefer a different story. So according to the Boston Globe, a couple of weeks ago, Charles Radin, their Middle East correspondent, according to him, Israel is fighting Hezbollah, which, like the Iranian regime, is sworn to the destruction of the Jewish state. It just doesn't matter that they have said they're willing to recognize it in accord with the Palestinian and Arab League proposal. And that's pretty standard. It's kind of unfair to pick him out. It provides a useful justification for U.S.-Israeli rejectionism, rejection of a political settlement, and insistence on violence. Well, from the start, it's now almost 37 years, the occupation has been harsh and brutal. There has been no credible security pretext. Today there's mounting savagery. There is a policy that was called the Gaza disengagement, hailed as very forthcoming. In fact, it was openly announced immediately as a West Bank expansion plan. Sane Israeli hawks and U.S. hawks understood that after Gaza had been reduced to being virtually unlivable after decades of occupation, it didn't make any sense at all to keep a few thousand Israeli settlers there, protected by a large part of the IDF, the Israeli army, taking over, I think it was about a third or so of the most valuable land and major resources, primarily water. That's pointless. Makes a lot more sense to transfer them over to the other occupied territories, mainly West Bank, also Golan Heights. Well, in order to make it look dramatic, they staged what was ridiculed by some Israeli commentators correctly. They staged a national trauma to make it look just extremely painful and to withdraw from this area. So, in fact, I'm sure you remember it. There was a huge media extravaganza, pictures of a little Jewish boy trying to hold back the soldiers, destroying his house, and so on, all staged. It was, and a lot of settlers were allowed in, so there could be a pretense of violence. There really wasn't any. But then you could say, well, never again, well, we shall abandon our land, Jews should not suffer so, and so on. The withdrawal could have been done perfectly quietly. All that was necessary was for Israel to announce, the withdrawal was on August 15th, just to announce that on August 1st, the IDF, the army, will withdraw. And immediately the settlers who had been subsidized to go there in the first place and to stay there would get onto the trucks that are provided for them and move over to the West Bank where they can move into new subsidized settlements. But if you did it that way, there wouldn't have been any national trauma, any justification for saying never can we give up another square millimeter of land and so on. What made all of this even more ridiculous was that it was a repetition of a staged trauma in 1982, what was described in Israel's leading paper, Haaretz, as Operation National Trauma 1982. After Israel finally agreed to Sadat's 1971 offer, it had to evacuate northeastern Sinai, and there was another staged trauma, which again was ridiculed by Israeli commentators. And by a miracle, none of the settlers who were resisting had even needed a Band-Aid while Palestinians are being killed all over the place. But you could have the same trauma. So that was carried out. Meanwhile, after the so-called withdrawal, Israel maintained Gaza as a prison. Israeli human rights groups call it the world's largest prison. Any access in or out is controlled by Israel. It's repeatedly stopped. The attacks on Gaza continued steadily. From September, the withdrawal, to June of this year, 144 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, including 29 children. Israeli casualties were 0. Became worse in January. What happened in January is that the Palestinians committed a major crime. They voted the wrong way in a free election, and that has to be punished. The U.S. and Israel immediately announced that they would punish the population for this democratic crime. They cut off supplies, they cut off funds that Israel is legally obligated to provide. They even went to the extent of cutting off water, which is really gratuitous cruelty in an area where water is extremely scarce. People don't have drinking water. It's a water-starved region. This is nothing new. In fact, it's standard operating procedure. There are many examples in recent American history. Famous one, or it should be famous, is Chile. When they voted the wrong way and elected Salvador Allende, the U.S. policies, there was a soft line and a hard line. The soft line was to make the economy scream, to punish the population for voting the wrong way. The hard line was to support a military coup, which led to what's often called in South America the first 9/11, 1973. Won't go into it, but in fact much more serious than the second 9/11. Well, that's what you do when people commit democratic crimes. And it's another sign, there are many other examples, and it's another sign of the almost visceral hatred of democracy, functioning democracy on the part of the Bush administration, but in fact elite opinion pretty generally. This goes back a long time. Democracy is fine under a particular definition. Democracy is fine if it comes down to do what we say or else. And the or else can be pretty brutal. The record is voluminous, but it's very well contained. It's one of the major successes of containment doctrine. In June of this year, 2006, the Israeli attacks in Gaza escalated. According to the United Nations, which keeps a detailed record, in June, there were 40 deaths, Palestinian deaths in Palestine, 36 in the Gaza Strip, 12 children. In June, there were 3 Israelis. That escalated very sharply after the capture of an Israeli soldier, Corporal Gilad Shalit, on June 25th. In the first month after his capture, 171 were killed, 34 children, quadrupling the killings. Israel destroyed the power system. That means virtually destroyed it. That means most of the scarce water supply is gone. By mid-September, a couple of weeks ago, more than 250 Gazans had been killed since July, including at least 45 children and 11 women. One of Israel's best reporters, the world's best reporters, Gidon Levy, describes Gaza as now a withered, blighted garden, enveloped in grief and suffering, bearing both in silence as this hot and lethal summer draws to a close. Pretty accurate. What was the reason for the June escalation? Well, there's an official story. Again, we can go to the Boston Globe. The Globe explained it as follows. It said the attack on military targets inside Israel, meaning the capture of Gilad Shalit, that military action led to an Israeli soldier being taken hostage. It was not merely an arbitrary reflex within a cycle of vengeance. It was ordered by someone with command responsibility in Hamas who could not be indifferent to the timing of his action or its political and military consequences. Because the hostage-taking operation has brought Palestinians and Israelis alike to the brink of a new round of foreseeable disasters, it is crucial that all concerned parties focus their remedial efforts on the right address, Hamas. That's the editorial. The editors call for the voice of reason. If unreason prevails, a tsunami of unnecessary suffering will break upon the peoples of the region. Well, it's useful to bear in mind that all of this is pure, cynical farce. That was demonstrated conclusively the day before the capture of Corporal Shalit. The day before, Israeli forces, June 24th, Israeli forces kidnapped and abducted 2 Gaza civilians, a doctor and his brother, the Muammar brothers, kidnapped. They can join 1,000 others somewhere in the Israeli prisons who were also kidnapped. It's called administrative detention, held without charges. There are about 8,000 others who were technically sentenced, but in trials that are a mockery. Many of them transported from the occupied territories to Israel, which is another violation of international law, Geneva Conventions, but with impunity, because it's under the umbrella of the outlaw superpower and the reigning intellectual and moral culture which permits all of this in clients. The kidnapping of the Muammar brothers was certainly known, but it wasn't reported in the Boston Globe. It was reported a little bit elsewhere. There were scattered reports, pretty marginal, quickly dismissed. The Washington Post had 87 words on it. It was quickly forgotten. Kidnapping of civilians is a far more serious crime than capture of a soldier. But crimes don't matter when they're committed by our side, just as elections don't count if they come out the wrong way. Now, recall that I'm not quoting the redneck barbarians. I'm quoting the voice of the educated liberal elite in the Athens of America, as it's self-designated. Well, that's Gaza. West Bank is much the same. There isn't as much massive violence, just random brutality, humiliation. It's been going on for decades now under the rubric of convergence, all totally illegal. The World Court determined that they were ruling on the separation wall, now the annexation wall, determined that it's totally illegal, unanimous. Even the U.S. Justice, who signed a separate declaration, declared any part of the wall built for defense of Israeli settlements, he said, is de facto in violation of international law. But it's backed by the global ruler, so therefore it's called moderate. And if you read the press and commentary, Prime Minister Olmert of Israel is praised for his courageous withdrawal plan, to translate to English his vicious and criminal annexation, dismemberment, and imprisonment plan, designed with U.S. aid to drive the final nails into the coffin of Palestinian national rights. Well, Olmert explains soulfully that he just has to do it. The reason is there's no Palestinian partner. Hamas, the governing party, doesn't qualify, nor did its predecessor. It's true that Hamas observed a year-and-a-half truce, despite regular Israeli atrocities, and it called for a semi-permanent truce during negotiations for a two-state settlement. But that's not enough. Hamas has to first satisfy 3 interesting conditions. First, it has to recognize Israel. Second, it has to renounce violence. And third, it has to accept prior agreements. Well, let's just imagine we had media and journals in the United States. What would they point out? Do Israel and the United States recognize Palestine? Do they renounce violence? Bad joke, of course not. But conditions are for the weak, not for the strong. That's a fundamental doctrinal principle. What about accepting prior agreements? Well, the New York Times editors delivered a stern lecture on this to Hamas. They instructed Hamas that they must agree to the 2002 Arab League peace plan, quoting it now, quoting the Times, since that is an admission ticket to the real world, a necessary rite of passage in the progression from a lawless opposition to a lawful government. Like others, the Times editors omitted a minor fact, namely the U.S. and Israel forcefully reject this proposal, and they are alone in doing so among the relevant actors. I can go on, but time's tight, so the other conditions are even more ludicrous. Well, that's Bush's vision, his famous vision, now being implemented as annexation, dismemberment, and imprisonment in the West Bank, imprisonment and destruction in the other half of Palestine. Hebrew University sociologist Baruch Kimmerling describes it as politicide, the destruction of a nation. That is something we don't see very often. And in fact, we don't see now either because we're carrying it out. So therefore, it's invisible. Well, that's the first crisis. The second crisis, Lebanon. On July 12th, Hezbollah captured 2 Israeli soldiers. That set off a fierce U.S.-Israeli attack and killed maybe 1,200 or 1,300 people, destroyed much of the country, aimed at infrastructure and at the population. The organization Doctors Without Borders, its spokesman reported that it had to use taxis because ambulances were being specifically targeted. Even the U.S. press did provide some fraction of the hideous story. It was actually much worse. There is now a ceasefire. The U.S. delayed the ceasefire as long as it could to permit maximal carnage, but the killings are going to continue despite the ceasefire without a shot being fired. Particularly in the last 3 days of the offensive, after the ceasefire had been announced, but before it was implemented, went into force. In those last 3 days, the IDF saturated southern Lebanon with over 1 million cluster bombs. These are extremely lethal anti-personnel weapons. About a third of them, roughly, don't explode on contact. They explode if you pick them up or hit them with a rake. Either that's incredibly bad quality control, or the intention is to render areas uninhabitable. The death toll right now is reported at about 4 a day. If a little child picks one of these things up, thinks it's a ball, his head's blown off. Patrick Coburn in the British press, excellent reporter, reports that Lebanon's farmers are caught in a deadly dilemma to risk the harvest or to leave the produce on which they depend to rot in the fields. Israeli artillery officers, who are now being quoted pretty extensively in the Hebrew press, estimated that the IDF fired 160,000 shells during the recent war. And by comparison, in the 1973 war with Egypt and Syria, that was a major war, the IDF fired less than 100,000 shells. Soldiers quoted in the Israeli press said their orders were, in the last 3 days, to fire everything they had, to destroy everything they could, to turn the region into a free fire zone. Didn't even know what they were shooting about, just like the master. So take Cambodia. In Henry Kissinger's immortal words, the orders to the Air Force were to hit anything, to send anything that flies against anything that moves. I don't know of such an explicit call for genocide in the archives of any state, but it passes unnoticed here. On July 13th, Israeli rockets hit a fuel storage tank at the main power station in Lebanon. And 2 days later, they returned, hitting the tank again, but destroying the concrete and earth barrier that's designed to prevent spilled oil from spilling into the Mediterranean. And there was a huge oil spill, the largest ever in the eastern Mediterranean. It's destroyed the coastline all the way up to Syria. It may reach Cyprus and Greece. It avoids Israel because of the way currents flow. Many of you, I'm sure, read Science magazine, the AAAS journal. Its latest issue says that the 15,000 tons have washed ashore, a small proportion of it. They reveal high concentration of cancer-causing aromatic hydrocarbons. Much has sunk below the surface, posing further risks to food chain and difficulties for cleanup. The environmental minister of Lebanon stated that A highly poisonous cloud has spread over a third of the country, an area that's home to half of its people from the fire that burned for 12 days. It has high levels of poisonous lead and mercury, highly dangerous PCBs. Continuing with him, not only have we been breathing this for a month, but all the agricultural produce has been subjected to it. Even worse, all of these poisons will come down with the rain. Some will seep through the soil and give us a polluted water table. Then in a couple of years, every single citizen in Lebanon will definitely be subjected to poisonous matter in his drinking water. He expected more Lebanese to die from the pollution than the 1,200 or 1,300 overwhelmingly civilians who were killed in the war. It's a bigger disaster even than the war itself. Notice that all of this is purposeful. You don't miss in targets like that. Well, what's the reason for the savagery of the U.S.-Israeli assault? And you should make no doubt about it, the blood is on our hands. There's a standard explanation, like the globes. Hezbollah committed an intolerable act of aggression by capturing the soldiers. And again, this is pure, cynical farce. For decades, Israel has been kidnapping Lebanese civilians in Lebanese territory, on the high seas, in transit from Cyprus to Lebanon, holding them for years, some decades, sometimes holding them as hostages, sometimes in secret prison torture chambers. Also known, no secret about this, but not reported in the United States. And of course, no one has ever called for an invasion of Israel in retaliation. So it's all farce, a complete farce. What about the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon? It's true, in the year 2000, Israel withdrew. That's after 22 years of brutal and murderous occupation in violation of Security Council orders, but with U.S. support, so it was okay. Since then, since the withdrawal, UNIFIL, the UN force in the south, keeps very careful records. They report daily violations of Lebanese territory by Israel. In contrast, the number of rocket firings in these 6 years attributed to Hezbollah is 0. There's one possible exception where the origin is undetermined. Well, if the world were ruled by justice, not force, the expanded UNIFIL force that we're all reading about would be not in southern Lebanon, but in northern Israel, or maybe in Washington, or in Boston. Well, there's a lot more to say about this, but I'll put it aside, and let's turn to the third crisis, Iraq. I don't have to describe the incredible catastrophe for Iraqis. We've read enough about that. What should the U.S. do at this point? Well, there are some principles. One principle is that invading armies have no rights whatsoever. They have only obligations and responsibilities. The first obligation is to pay massive reparations for the crime of aggression, the supreme international crime, according to the Nuremberg judgments, which encompasses all the evil that follows. And a second obligation would be to put on trial the people responsible for the supreme international crime. Well, that's the first. The second major obligation is to observe the will of the victims. That's a primary obligation of an invading force. And we know pretty well what that will is. There are regular U.S.-run polls taken in Iraq. The most recent one released said that a couple of months ago that 87% of Iraqis, it includes Kurds incidentally, 87% of the population wants a concrete timetable for withdrawal. That was the wording. Tony Blair and George Bush immediately announced that it would not happen. We will, as Bush put it at the UN 2 days ago, we will not abandon you in your struggle to build a free nation, meaning we will not accept the will of 87% of the population that we set a firm timetable for withdrawal. Doesn't really matter what 87% of the population want. It's another toothpick to add to the mountain of evidence demonstrating the visceral hatred for democracy. There's a technical name for it in Western commentary. It's called Democracy Promotion or Visions of Democracy and so on. There's a great deal of discussion going on about withdrawal plans. Almost invariably, I have yet to find an exception, evading the main issue. The U.S., for the United States, for U.S. planners, a sovereign Iraq would be a complete nightmare. Simply consider its likely policies. A sovereign, moderately democratic Iraq has a Shiite majority. First thing they would do, the fact doing it already, is to improve relations with Shiite Iran next door. Majority of the clerics that come from there, one of the major militias in the south was trained there. They may not love Iran, but they'd much prefer friendly relations than hostility with their major neighbor. It's already happening. Right across the border in Saudi Arabia, there happens to be a Shiite majority. And as Iran has even tentative moves towards sovereignty, it increases pressures there for some kind of at least minimal human rights. They're under vicious repression from the U.S.-backed tyranny, but also some sort of autonomy. You can see what might develop. I'm sure Washington planners are having nightmares about it. What might develop is a loose Shiite alliance, southern Iraq, Iran, neighboring areas of Saudi Arabia, and that happens to be where most of Saudi oil is. So that alliance would control most of the world's energy, independent of Washington. An unspeakable nightmare, which could get a lot worse. Europe is intimidated when the U.S. shakes its fist and backs off. China isn't. That's why China is considered a great threat. It's not a military threat, but it won't be intimidated. I've been around for 3,000 years. I have no particular interest in what the barbarians are saying. So they continue to invest, including in Saudi Arabia, the prize, send military aid, every reason why they would like to attract this alliance into their orbit. There are already major organizations. Shanghai Cooperation Council includes South Central Asian states, an Asian energy security grid based primarily in China, including Russia and neighboring states. They'll probably include India before too long. If the Middle East oil resources move into it, the United States becomes a second-class power. Controlling the world's energy resources has been a prime policy objective for 60 years, just as it was for Britain before us, and for obvious reasons. Well, that's not trivial. Any withdrawal proposal that doesn't take this into consideration is just not serious. The Pentagon can think up withdrawal plans as easily as we can in our spare time, but what happens afterwards? Well, unless you think about that, you're not talking about withdrawal. Let's talk about the fourth crisis briefly, Iran. That's an extremely dangerous one. And there are possible peaceful settlements. 3 years ago, in May 2003, the Khatami government, that's the reformist moderate government, but with the support of the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, they offered the United States negotiations on all issues, on a two-state settlement of Israel-Palestine, on nuclear issues, and so on. The U.S. did respond, and they responded by reprimanding the Swiss diplomat who brought the offer. And that was the total response. And so it continues. Right afterwards, Iran and the European Union entered into an agreement, a bargain. The bargain was that Iran would suspend its uranium enrichment programs, to which it's entitled under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it would suspend them. And in return, the European Union would provide what were called firm guarantees on security issues. Well, everyone knows what security issues means. It means U.S. and Israeli threats, credible threats, to attack Iran. Those threats, incidentally, are themselves a major violation of international law, which bars the threat or use of force. But again, when an outlaw state carries it out, the educated community accepts it as legitimate. The negotiations went on for about 2 years. The European Union backed down on its side, apparently under U.S. pressure. After that, Iran backed down also and returned to uranium enrichment. The way it's described here is Iran broke the agreement, returned to uranium enrichment. Not quite the story. Well, the U.S. has indicated, under plenty of pressure, a willingness to negotiate, but on 2 conditions. The first condition is that the outcome of the negotiations, namely no uranium enrichment, is a precondition for negotiations. It has to be fixed in advance. So first you fix the outcome, then we have negotiations. Second is that the negotiations must proceed when Iran has a gun to its head. The U.S. refuses to withdraw the threats of attack. Well, that renders negotiations virtually meaningless. As I said, the threats are in violation of international law, but that's a minor detail. And the threats are very real. They're not just words. The last couple of years, the United States has sent to Israel over 100 advanced F-16s, produced by our generous benefactor in the next room. These are publicly advertised as capable of bombing Iran and returning. Israel already has air and armored forces that, believe it or not, are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power outside the United States. But this is a supplement aimed specifically and publicly at Iran. Germany has just sent to Israel submarines equipped to carry nuclear-tipped missiles. The purpose of that is well known. The purpose is to strengthen Israel's second strike capacity, and those of you who play strategic analysis games know that that means undermining any potential Iranian deterrent to an attack. These actions and threats have 2 immediate effects, which are well understood. The first effect is to harm Iranian reformers, democratic reformers, who are complaining bitterly about it. The most well-known of them, Shirin Ebadi, 2003 Nobel Prize laureate, has written that the threat of regime change by military force, reserved as an option by some in the Western world, polite reference to the United States, that threat endangers nearly all the efforts democracy-minded Iranians have made in these recent years. The threat of military force gives the system a pretext to crack down on its legitimate opposition and undermines the nascent civil society that is slowly taking shape here. It means Iranians overlook their resentment of the regime and move behind their unpopular leaders out of defensive nationalism. I can think of no scenario more alarming, no internal shift more dangerous than that engendered by the West, U.S., imagining that it can bring democracy to Iran through either military might or the fomentation of violent rebellion. And her position has been forcefully reiterated by other leading Iranian reformers and dissidents, and the reasons are clear. The second consequence of the U.S. stance is that it deters efforts to reach a political settlement, which might well be possible. Well, opposition to an attack in Iran is even greater than opposition to the Iraq War, where it incidentally was overwhelming worldwide. The international Gallup polls found practically no country where support was greater than 10%. Current polls reveal, pretty surprisingly, that in the neighboring states, Iran's neighbors, that is Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, the public prefers a nuclear-armed Iran to any U.S. military action. And even in Europe, which is the part of the world that's most supportive of Washington, the U.S. is considered the major threat to world peace, ranking far above Iran or any other country listed in the polls, which includes China, Russia, and North Korea. The U.S. military presence in Iraq is ranked as a greater threat than Iranian nuclear weapons. And the Israel-Palestine conflict is ranked as among the greatest threats to world peace. Well, in some sense, all of this awful news is actually good news. The reason is that we live in the state that is regarded worldwide as a lawless and dangerous rogue state, but we also have incomparable freedoms, an incomparable legacy of freedom and of privilege, and that means that the power to end these crimes and avert further ones lies in our hands. Thanks.
We have 2 microphones over here. Please line up and we'll take your questions.
Where are the microphones?
Sorry.
Where are the microphones?
One over here and one over there.
Oh, okay. Well, if people would like to say something, why don't you come down to the mics? Okay. Just alternate.
Hi. Mr. Chomsky, you give us the impression that all of Israel's neighbors are just looking for peace and would be perfectly content to live side by side with a Jewish state. But isn't the real cause of this conflict Arab rejection of a Jewish state entirely? And isn't that evidenced by the following 3 brief facts? That in 1948, the day after Israel declared its independence, 5 Arab armies declared war on Israel. For a long time after that, a common Arab saying was, "We will not accept a Jewish state even if it is the size of a postage stamp." And in 2000, after the failures of Camp David, whoever's fault they were, after failures of negotiation, instead of trying to reach out more, Arafat launched the second intifada, killing hundreds of innocent Israelis.
Well, let me repeat the facts, which Israeli and U.S. propaganda don't like to accept. The Palestinians formally accepted a 2-state settlement decades ago. The Arab states proposed it at the United Nations in 1976. The Arab League formally accepted not only a 2-state settlement, but normalization of relations with Israel. That's accepted by Iran. It's accepted by Hezbollah. Hamas accepts it. That's the situation for the past 30 years. Arafat launched, to go through your 3 points, remind me if I miss one, to say that Arafat launched the Intifada is just propaganda. Arafat didn't stop it, but there's no evidence they launched it. It's true that the Intifada began after the collapse of Camp David, but you have to add to that that the Camp David proposals, the U.S.-Israeli proposals, were totally unacceptable. They were rejected by all Arabs. They were rejected by Abbas, America's favorite, and Clinton himself recognized that they were totally unacceptable. In fact, a couple of months later, the negotiations broke down in the summer. A couple of months later, Clinton announced his famous parameters in December. They were somewhat vague, but more forthcoming than the impossible Camp David proposals, as Clinton recognized were unacceptable. Those parameters were the framework. Immediately after Clinton announced the parameters, well, just to quote Clinton's words, both sides accepted the parameters. Both sides had reservations. They then met in Taba, Egypt, to deal with the reservations, with the consequence I mentioned. They came very close to agreement. It was called off by Israel. That's the situation. The first point in 1948, by now there's a huge literature on this. I mean, to get to the first comment you made is that the Arab states would not be content to live with a Jewish state there. That's correct. They certainly wouldn't be content. Frankly, I wouldn't be content. And as a Zionist youth leader in the 1940s, I was part of the Zionist movement that was strongly opposed to a Jewish state, just as we'd be opposed to a Christian state or an Islamic state and so on.
Why aren't you railing about all of the Islamic states?
I do all the
Middle
time.
East?
I mean, very bitterly, in much harsher terms.
Really? Because I don't hear a lot of that
because you
argument from you.
If you read the stuff that comes out of the ADL, you won't read it. If you read what I write, you find it all the time. In fact, I just said it today. You heard me say it today. I condemn the brutal tyranny in Saudi Arabia, which is the oldest and most valued U.S. ally, the most extreme fundamentalist state in the world, and the rest of them too. You didn't hear it, but it's there. So yes, they certainly wouldn't be content with it, nor should any of us, in my opinion, but nor should Israelis. The state is designated by the High Court, the Supreme Court, as the state of the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora, not the state of its citizens. So it's your state and my state, but not the state of its citizens. I don't think we should accept that any more than we should accept an Islamic state or a Christian state in the United States. And it's not just symbolism. I won't go through the details, but it's a lot. So certainly they wouldn't be content with it. But they've accepted it. As for 1948, there's extensive literature on it. I won't go through it, but Israeli scholarship in the past several decades has gone into this in great detail with archival materials that were released and so on. If you want a good picture of it, one excellent book is Israeli historian Avi Shleim's book Iron Wall, but there are many others. What happened was, of course, neither side, right after the UN General Assembly recommendation in November 47, a civil war broke out. This kind of, I won't go through the details, but in May 1948, Israel did declare a state, and yes, by that time, it had already driven out about 300,000 Palestinians and expanded into the designated Palestinian state. At that point, states of the Arab armies entered, but they were extremely weak. The only serious army was the Transjordan Legion under British control, which basically kept out of the fighting. And their concerns were, it appears, primarily to counter Britain. This was a period of anti-colonial uprising. And they were concerned with Jordan, Transjordan, and became Jordan, which is a British outpost. And part of the reason for their entry was apparently to counter the ambitions of King Abdullah of Jordan and the British behind him. Remember, they were British colonies, virtually. And there was fighting, and it wasn't a joke. For about 10 days, it was serious. Then Czech arms came in, Eastern European arms, and the outcome to Israel, and the outcome was certain. But the first 10 days were kind of touch and go. But the fighting took place almost entirely in the designated Palestinian state. The outcome of the fighting was a partition of the designated Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel, virtually in half. And furthermore, it was largely by collusion. Again, Avi Shleim wrote the major scholarly source on this called Collusion Over Jordan. The half of the Palestinian state that was incorporated into Israel is now just called Israel. Nobody talks about it. The half that was administered by Jordan is called the West Bank. That's what happened in 1948. As to the rest, you can find plenty of outrageous statements by anyone you like on all sides and plenty of actions. But the fact is, the crucial fact is, that clearly and explicitly in 1971, the major Arab military force by far, Egypt, offered a full peace treaty. I've already been through that. And now we have 35 years of U.S.-Israeli rejectionism. Okay, those are the core facts.
Three very brief points for your comment. First of all, I was pleased to see that Hugo Chavez apparently has some very interesting reading tastes, and I just wondered if you had a sort of personal interlude, if you had any response you'd like to share to his comments yesterday at the UN. Secondly, on your way in, I tried to hand you a flyer that I saw on my way over here, advertising a so-called information session for the CIA recruiting here at MIT. And I just wonder, it's related to what we're talking about tonight. Is it time for people to begin challenging, and what ways might it be appropriate for people to be challenging on-campus recruiting by entities like the CIA, given their evident involvement in torture, etc.? And thirdly, in trying to do anything about the things that you so carefully teach us about, one encounters the congressman from this district, Capuano, voting along with the overwhelming majority to endorse the Israeli invasion this past summer, and the Congressman Ed Markey, who's believed to be very good on some other issues, reacting with extreme indignation when asked about Israel, saying, but look at the withdrawal that they made. You know, I mean, this sort of trauma, the theater of trauma that you mentioned, he seemed to be a strong advocate of that version of that account of it. So given the obstacles, maybe you'd care to talk a little bit about how we can overcome some of the obstacles to making some change in U.S. policy.
Well, look, if this were Stalinist Russia, it would be a problem. But it isn't. It's the most free country in the world. It really is. We have enormous privilege as well as freedom. So, yeah, there's things you can do very much within the mainstream to counter these doctrines. I quoted the Boston Globe, which is kind of a spokesman or whatever you want to call it for left liberalism in the United States, and yes, Markey and others are like it. In fact, the record of the Democrats on this is by and large worse than that of the Bush administration. But it's not beyond our power to influence what congressional representatives do. I mean, it's kind of absurd. I mean, take countries that really have problems. I mean, we should be ashamed of ourselves when we compare what goes on here with what goes on in the poorest countries of the world. So take, say, the poorest country of South America, Bolivia. I mean, they had an election last December that we can't even dream of. I mean, it was an election where the mass of the population participated. They didn't just show up on election day. They were carrying popular movements, carrying out struggles constantly over major issues. Population knew what the issues were. They were serious ones. They came to an election. They elected someone from their own ranks, poor peasant. What do? We had an election shortly before that. Two candidates, both born to wealth and political power. Both went to the same elite university, joined the same secret society where you're trained to be a member of the ruling class. They were able to run because they're supported by pretty much the same concentrations of economic power. They had pretty similar programs to the extent you could even discover their programs. The party managers are very careful to keep the issues out of sight because the population opposes both parties on major issues. And the election ended up like about on a level of, picking a lifestyle drug on the basis of ads on television. That's here, where there's no terror, there's no repression, there's no violence, you don't get killed by the police, and every option's open. That's Bolivia, where it's a lot harsher. Literally, we should be ashamed of ourselves. Incidentally, these are things that ought to be taught not just in university political sciences departments, but in 8th grade civics classes. We have every opportunity we would like. If we don't use it, if we don't use them, nobody to blame but ourselves. The opportunities are certainly there. We're not Bolivian peasants, and they do it. And the same in much of the world. And pretty much the same goes for the second question about the first one, actually, about the CIA. First of all, it's not a new issue. This was a very live issue in the early 1960s at MIT. Up to the early 1960s, The political science department was publicly, openly funded by the CIA. Nobody was trying to conceal it. By then, it was getting a little embarrassing, so it goes on some other way, I don't know how. But it's not public. But right through the 60s, there were substantial protests about CIA and other military recruitment on campus. And in fact, it went off campus, it went across the street. And if it's drifting back on, well, same point. If you don't like it, there's plenty we can do about it, and there's plenty of precedents for it.
First, I would like to thank Professor Chomsky for his enlightening insights. I have kind of a couple of questions to you. First one is, in the 40s, 50s, maybe 60s, the Zionist cause was perceived as some kind of a progressive cause.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
I'm saying
Say it again.
In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in Europe, the Zionist cause was perceived to be some kind of a progressive cause, and that's one of the, at least perceived by the European left, and that's one of the reasons why the West, especially Europe, lent its support behind Israel. Right now in Europe, the Palestinian cause is the progressive cause in the sense, or I'm saying perceived by European left, in the sense of perceiving Palestinian cause as a cause of national liberation, as a cause of fighting Israeli ethnic and racial segregation, comparable to the apartheid model of South Africa. And also in the same token, Palestinian struggle fighting against the militarism, fascist, imperialist, expansionist pretensions of Israel, etc., etc. Unfortunately, this is not the case in the United States, where the American left, if there is an American left, which doesn't really consider the Palestinian cause as a progressive cause. My question, plain and simple, when will this happen and how will it happen in the United States? Well, that's my first question. Yeah. Would you like to answer?
Yeah. Well, just to look at the history a little bit, it's unfortunate but true that through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there wasn't a Palestinian cause. There should have been, but there wasn't. And there's a reason for that. There had been a Palestinian revolt in 1936 to 39, a popular revolt against the British. It was a British colony. And it was put down violently by the British with, the Jewish community. There was no Israel. The Jewish settlement, the Yishuv, it was called, cooperated, of course. And it was devastating to the Palestinian society. It was a largely, semi-feudal, mostly peasant, middle-class urban society. It wasn't organized for warfare. And they struggled for it, but they were crushed. And they were just in no position to do much. Then came 48. They couldn't deal with it. They were fighting a major army. And crushed even more, and most of them dispersed. And in the 50s and the 60s, it was dispersed communities. That's why in 1967, the major document, UN 242, barely even mentions the Palestinians. It has a couple of phrases about refugees. That was the Palestinian cause. In the 70s, it changed. That's why the change took place that you described. By the 1970s, the Palestinian issue did enter the international agenda. That's why you had the 1976 resolution vetoed by the U.S. and a whole pile of others. And it isn't just the European left, it's most of the world. It's not the American left that's not part of it, it's the United States that's not part of it. The United States has almost unilaterally barred this. It's headed the rejectionist camp. It's all kind of reasons for it. My own interpretation, which I've written about, is that what happened in 1960, the U.S. didn't have a close relationship with Israel until 1967. It didn't amount to, there was some, but didn't amount to much. 1967 is the year in which the U.S.-Israel relationship really firmed up. And there was a reason. In 1967, there was a struggle going on in the Arab world between the radical fundamentalist camp, of which Saudi Arabia is the main part, and a secular nationalist Arab movement, which Nasser was the main part. In fact, Saudi Arabia and Nasser of Egypt. Saudi Arabia and Egypt were, in fact, fighting a proxy war at that point in the Yemen. Well, the U.S. was lined up with Islamic fundamentalists, as it's been throughout most of the this whole period since the Second World War. It's been lined up with radical Islamic fundamentalists against secular nationalism. That's not only Saudi Arabia, it's also the origins of Hamas. I mean, Israel, which agrees with the U.S. on this, was supporting radical Islamic fundamentalists in the occupied territories against the secular PLO. And Hezbollah comes from the same roots. And, we all know about the roots of Al-Qaeda and the rest. The radical fundamentalists organized by the Reagan administration for their own political ends. So the U.S. has been overwhelmingly on the radical fundamentalist side. In 1967, Israel performed a huge service to the U.S., Saudi Arabia, the energy corporations. It destroyed the center of secular Arab nationalism, which was posing a threat. It was posing the threat of using the energy resources of the region for its own population, not just for the benefit of Western corporations and so on, but not just, with some of it, a side part of it going into the pockets of the rich rulers. Well, that was a threat. And once Israel eliminated that threat, it became a strong ally of the U.S. In 1970, that continued. In 1970, Jordan, U.S.-British client, was murdering Palestinians, Black September. It looked briefly as if Syria might intervene to stop the slaughter. The U.S. didn't want that, but it was totally bogged down into China. Couldn't do a thing. And Israel performed another service. It mobilized the Army and the Air Force to deter potential Syrian intervention to protect the Palestinians, which was regarded as a threat to the oil monarchies. Well, U.S. aid to Israel, I think, quadrupled that year. And, it's at that point that Israel established itself as what's called a strategic asset. It was part of the system by which the U.S. tries to control the region successfully for many years. Well, when U.S. policy shifted to support for Israel, the intellectual community almost reflexively joins. It's not just on this, but on anything. I mean, talk about other topics, you find pretty much the same thing. So that was one factor. Another factor was that there were domestic issues. Remember, this was in the middle of the Vietnam War. The U.S. was failing to crush Vietnamese resistance. Now, people later told a different story. But if you go back to that time, which I remember very well, and you can certainly read about it, at that time, the liberal Americans were supporting the war. I mean, they may be complaining because it's costing too much or something, but they supported the war. In fact, they really never offered any principal objection to the war, just that it's costing too much. But not the population, but the intellectual community. Well, they were pretty upset that the United States was unable to crush these little yellow dwarves, as Johnson called them. Israel came along and showed how you treat third world people properly. You kick them in the face, and you beat them to a pulp. They won a lot of points for that from liberal humanists who are supposed to posture about being in favor of peace and love and so on, but are really watching Rambo movies in their spare time. That's kind of the psychology. And yeah, they won a lot of points for that too. And there were other things happening inside the United States. Students were not following orders. There was a youth culture. The women's movement was beginning. Places was blown up. The centers of authority are being challenged. Well, again, Israel was a symbol of how you take care of that. And they won plenty of points among liberal intellectuals. And there were other things, but I think those are major factors. It was pretty much the same in Europe. I wouldn't exaggerate. There's some difference. But remember, Europe is a little more dissociated from direct involvement in the U.S. policies in the Middle East. They kind of tacitly support them, but they're not directly involved. To some extent they are, like Britain was supplying arms to Israel during the current war. Germany, as I mentioned, is providing Israel with submarines that can take nuclear-armed missiles, which eliminate an Iranian deterrent. Yeah, they're all involved. Right now, just a couple days ago, Germany announced that it'll be patrolling the Lebanese coast. It's not going to control the Israeli coast. And that's where the invasions are coming from. But Europe goes along with European opinion, pretty much goes along with the United States on this. It's true that the discussion isn't as constrained in Europe. There's critics, that find some critical voices, and there's political organizations in Europe, as you say, which are different. But the differences aren't massive, and I think they're largely explained by the directness of the involvement in the actions. The same is true on Iraq and other issues. Take, say, the invasion of Iran. Europe is overwhelmingly opposed. So is the U.S. military, so is intelligence or elites. But a lot of the population is terrified that Iran's going to come and get us. It was the same on Iraq. Even today, you take a look at polls. I forget the latest numbers, but I think around half the population thinks that Saddam had something to do with 9/11, or that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, that they're coming after us. I get letters, I'll get them tonight, saying, how can you support, as if I do, how can you support Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran when they're just about to strangle us and destroy us? If you look at this from the outside, you don't know whether to laugh or weep when you look at the actual history, apart from the disparity of force. But there are plenty of people who believe it. And in fact, there's something really significant here about American cultural history. The U.S. is far and away the most powerful country in the world, hasn't been under any threat since 1812, 1814. But nevertheless, there's a strain of fear in American popular culture that goes way back. There's some good studies of it. There's a very good book by Bruce Franklin called War Stars, which is literary critic, which is a study of popular literature, the kind of things that people like Harry Truman were reading when they grew up. And there's a strain in popular literature, which now shows up in television and movies, but it used to be magazines and books and so on, which the strain is that the U.S. is being attacked by an overwhelmingly powerful force, which is just about to destroy us, when at the last minute, a superhero or a super weapon or a bunch of high school students in the hills or whatever it is suddenly rescue us from this demon. And if you look at the demon, it's usually somebody we're crushing. So originally the demon was the indigenous population. Then it was the blacks. In the late 19th century, it was the Chinese. You think that they're Chinese laundrymen, but that's not what they are. They're these millions of Chinese, seeping into the United States to take us over and destroy us. In fact, Jack London, who's a progressive writer, wrote a story, I think the early 20th century, in which he literally called for destruction of the population of China by bacteriological warfare to defend ourselves against those Chinese laundrymen. And this strain goes right to the present. I'm sure people your age have seen it on television and the movies. What the psychology is, it's a complicated affair, but it has something to do with overwhelming power, I think. If you're crushing people, you have to have a justification for it. And there aren't many justifications. One justification is, well, they're evil and they deserve it. Another justification is we're doing it for self-defense. That's pretty common. You go back to, say, Germany in the 30s. Remember, Germany was it was the peak of Western civilization. And it was the peak of the arts and the sciences. That's where you went to study physics and so on. Within a couple of years, it was turned into a society of raving lunatics. Nothing like it in history. And a lot of it was plain fear. The Jews are going to destroy us. They're trying to destroy the Aryan race, not just us, but the Aryan race. We have to defend ourselves. Unfortunately, you find a lot of things like this in history and in American culture. It goes way back, and it's prevalent today. That's something to deal with. But that was,
I have another question. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Shorter answers.
Okay, my other question is quite broader than the Middle East. And it's quite, I'm trying to address here Dr. Chomsky, the leftist anarchist thinker. I would say, like, after a whole century of failure of the left, I mean, progressive left in establishing its alternative to a capitalist status quo, I mean, the catastrophic failure of state socialism, state capitalism, state welfarism, anarcho-syndicalism, all sorts of leftist alternatives to the capitalist status quo. Now we're back to the old Leninist question, what's to be done? I mean, we have a lot of moral rage out there. We are against, I don't know, corporate capitalism, we are against consumerist culture, we're against imperialist expansion, etc., etc. But how can we translate this moral rage into constructive political capital, constructive political action? And how can this be possible in a society which is very unidimensional, creating its own opposition, making its opposition thinking the same way as the mainstream, I mean, I would say in our society, even the opposition is thinking in corporatist terms. I mean, the corporatist, consumerist worldview framework is still shaping the mindset of the opposition. I mean, how can we think creatively about this? How can we have this politics of, I would say, imagination to accompany politics of resistance?
There doesn't take much of it. It's pretty simple, in my opinion. First of all, I don't agree with the history. I mean, the major attack on socialism in the 20th century, in my opinion, was the Bolshevik coup that destroyed the socialist movements of Russia, which were significant. I mean, it destroyed one of the first things that Lenin and Trotsky did was to destroy the workers' councils, the Soviets, eliminate the Constituent Assembly, in fact, any democratic and socialist institution that had developed, and for a principled reason. I mean, they were kind of orthodox Marxists. They saw Russia as a backward peasant society, which was true. You can't have a revolution there. You have to drive it by force to industrialization, and the iron laws of history come along and so on. But that was a major attack on socialism. In fact, I think that they were one of the main barriers to socialism throughout the 20th century. When the Berlin Wall fell, there was a symposium in the nation where people were supposed to talk about it. And if you look at the articles, they surprised me. I mean, social democrats who had been opposed to the Russians for years wailed about the collapse of socialism. I had an article, and I said, it's a small victory for socialism. It'll kind of, like the elimination of fascism, it overcomes some of the barriers. I don't think anybody understood what I was talking about, but yeah, that's what I think it was. There have been plenty of victories. I mean, we live in a much more free society with far more rights than a century ago, or than 30 years ago, for that matter. I mean, in many ways, the activism of the 60s caused a real major transformation of American society. Now, let's just take MIT. You know, I've been here for over 50 years. If you walk down the halls of MIT in the early 60s, what you saw was well-dressed white males, deferential, polite, and so on. Take a walk down the halls today. That's not what you see. That's everywhere in the country, and it reflects big changes. Well, they didn't come about by people saying, "What can we do?" You know, they came about by people doing it. And yeah, we can do it at any time. In fact, if you, I mean, it's true that there are barriers, but you know, a huge PR industry that tries to drive people to consumerism is nothing like torture chambers and secret police. You know, yeah, it's a barrier, but a lot easier to deal with. And I don't even think, and in fact, if you count the number of people today, young people in particular, involved in one or another form of activism, I think it's probably larger than the 60s. Actually, this meeting is a perfect example. The first meeting at MIT on the Palestinian issues, I remember it very well, I spoke, was in 1969. And, you know, you could barely get out alive if you talked about things like this. And right through into the 1990s, there was police protection at meetings at MIT if Palestinian topics came up. It's changed, you know, even in the last few years, because a lot of people are doing something about it. So there's no need for, I don't think there ever were complicated answers in the past, ever. The answers we have ever been understood are pretty simple ones, and we can proceed to implement them. It's more a failure of will than opportunity, I think. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see somebody over there. Yeah.
Professor Chomsky, I'd like to again say how grateful we are to have heard you speak. I was wondering if I could ask two questions. One about the two-state solution that you were talking about today, the solution for Palestine and Israel. And don't you think even if a two-state solution were to be achieved, it would be a defeat for radicals? As far as I remember, it has always been talk about having a one-state solution. And why aren't we talking about that anymore? And, can we go back to notions of secular socialist Middle East again? And can we go back to a one-state solution? And the second one was...
Well, I understand. Actually, if you were really listening carefully, I threw in a phrase there, which required another talk, saying that a two-state solution might open the doors to better outcomes for all the people of the region, and that's exactly what I had in mind. It's fine to... First of all, I don't think a one-state solution makes any sense. In fact, for most societies, the nation-state is a kind of a European invention, which was imposed by violence. That's why Europe was the most violent, savage area of the world for centuries, trying to establish these borders. And most of the horrible wars going around the world today are residues of the colonial system, which tried to impose similar systems everywhere. It's India, Pakistan, Africa, in fact, Israel, Palestine, almost everywhere. So it's a rotten system. But the reason it doesn't, it's so savage is it just doesn't deal with the complexities of societies. It sort of forces them all into a mold that people aren't like that. They have all kind of interests and concerns. The Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean region, it's particularly true there. It's a very complex mosaic of different societies, ethnic groups, religious groups, class conflicts, all sorts of things. And imposing state boundaries there, as the colonial powers did, is bound to leave a residue of violence and conflict. So I don't think the right long-term goal is a one-state solution. It sort of works in the United States, but there's a reason for that. The complexity and variety of this society was essentially wiped out by extermination. So yeah, if you wipe out the indigenous societies and you bring in a lot of Anglo-Saxon, what are called Anglo-Saxon, they aren't, of course, immigrants, then yeah, you get a fairly homogeneous society. So yes, you can have one state, but it doesn't work in most of the world. In fact, European societies are sensibly moving slowly towards more autonomy, more regionalism, revival of local cultures, and so on, which are kind of multinational societies, not necessarily national. There's other groups too. So I think the basic right answer in the former Palestine is at least a binational state, and then on to no state, like integrating the whole region more fully. But it has to come in stages. People who are calling for a one-state settlement, in my view, are really performing a service for the far right. And there's a reason for that. There's just no, you have to make a distinction between proposing something and actually advocating it. Okay, like we can propose that everybody should live in peace and love. Okay, I proposed it. It doesn't mean anything. It's how do we get there? And it's the same when you propose a one-state settlement. How do you get there? Well, the only advocacy I have ever heard is through stages, of which today a two-state settlement is the first. People who say, no, let's just have a one-state settlement, they're giving a gift to the ultra-right. They say, well, if that's the only alternative, we have to defend ourselves, because there's no support for it. I mean, the number of people in Israel who you could support it, you could put in a telephone booth, So it's just saying, well, okay, we have to defend ourselves from people who have to try to destroy us. But you could get to it in stages. Now, there was a period, and what you're referring to, when I was calling for a move towards a federal solution and a binational state. But those are different circumstances. Advocacy depends on circumstances. between 1967 and mid-70s, there was an opportunity for a federal solution in the former Palestine. Palestinians would have accepted it. I think the Israelis would have accepted it. There were proposals, I briefly mentioned them, even from Israeli intelligence, not calling for that, but calling for steps that might lead to that. So that was a possible step, feasible step. And that could lead to binationalism. It could lead to lessening tensions, and you can go on from there. However, it was strongly opposed by all sides, bitterly opposed by all sides, so it didn't get anywhere. And after the 73 war, the opportunity was lost. And by the time the Palestinian national issue had been formulated by Palestinians and on the international agenda, I just don't see any first step other than a two-state settlement. So if you, and this is generalizes, if you want to advocate something, whatever it is, nuclear disarmament, environmental issues, whatever, advocacy requires paying attention to existing circumstances and asking, what can we do next? Yeah, you can have long-term visions which maybe guide your decisions, but you can't just propose the long-term solutions. That doesn't mean anything.
Thank you. Sorry, Professor Chomsky, if I could quickly ask, just very briefly, you mentioned about the possibilities that are open to us, and they do exist. But, I imagine that your view of the state is, like, the most important thing is civil society, and this is, like, so control of the state might not necessarily change the important things, the sort
for the long term,
the moats and all the networks that make civil society up. And I was just wondering that in our civil society, I mean, like, just in our classes at Harvard, like, all that we're learning is how to be good administrators and how to be good, like, in our class today about the American presidency, we learned that, like, America is really divided among parties and there is no agreement and the media is critical. I mean, I learned this today and it was completely ridiculous. And
you mean, what do we do right away to deal with factionalism and conflicts and so on?
Right, and they're like, well, no one will ever agree on anything, and there's no new Marshall Plan.
Life is a complicated affair. People have lots of interests, and you try to deal with them. Families are hard to deal with.
So if we're learning things like this,
what?
So if we're learning sort of nonsense like this at the kind of institutions that we're going to, if we're learning these things, if they're telling us that.
I don't really understand.
No, but my question is, how do we penetrate, how do we change civil society, not necessarily government?
Let's take MIT again in the last 40 years. How did it change from a student body of deferential, well-dressed white males to this?
Well, the average income... What is the average income among MIT students? I mean, it's still very high.
It came from people of your age trying to do something about it.
But the idea, like, for instance, could you tell us a class that we could take just at Harvard, which is critical, which is taught by a socialist professor, which is challenging our social norms? There isn't one.
Look,
I couldn't find one.
If you want a magic key, you're not going to find it. The only way to do it is educational efforts, consciousness raising, organization.
But there's not a single professor at Harvard willing to teach a class that challenges society. There's not a single one.
You're asking for a formula that's going to fit all cases, and there has never been one, and there will never be one. There's a history of significant progress, certainly in my lifetime, even in your lifetimes, and a lot of things are happening now that you couldn't have thought of 10 years ago. I mean, take, say, the global justice movement, what are ludicrously called anti-globalization. Those are huge popular movements all over the world, here too. There wasn't even a seed of them 10 years ago. How did they develop?
What did they accomplish?
They've accomplished plenty. I mean, there are now, there's an international agenda, widely supported, plenty of involvement, confronting the neoliberal orthodoxies and changing them. Where do you think the Bolivian movement came from, or the MST? I mean, if you take a look at South America, I mean, the governments that the United States now regards as allies are the kind of governments that would have been trying to overthrow 30 or 40 years ago, because the continent has just shifted significantly towards a bit of some integration, social progress, development, independence, There's a rise of indigenous movements for the first time. These are all major changes. And the World Social Forum meets in the South for a good reason. That's where the major centers of activism and popular movements have been. But the North is involved. There's a Boston Social Forum, which is kind of an umbrella group for lots of activism, working on issues relevant here. And yeah, you move ahead on these things. If you want a magic key, there's never been one in the past. There will never be one in the future. It's any more than any other kind of interpersonal relations. I mean, suppose you have problems in your family. There's no formula that says how you deal with them. You deal with them in terms of the sympathetic understanding of the actual situation and an effort to make progress.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky, and thank you everyone for attending.